Hey guys, I'm UnoPro and this is my guide to all things Spellhai. For those of you unfamiliar with the term Spellhai, it basically refers to Songhai decks centered around casting lots of spells and the use of spell synergy minions to continuously clear the board whilst also doing lots of damage to your opponent. A lot of people think of Spellhai as an aggro deck, but it often spends the earlier turns simply dealing with the opponent's threats before comboing out massive damage in the late game. I personally hit S rank this month using a Spellhai deck, and it is definitely a very strong deck with high skill cap and lots of challenging situations. Spellhai is a deck that is viable with both Songhai factions, Kalios and Reaver. Now they have very different Bloodborne spells and both have their place in a Spellhai deck. When choosing which deck you want to play, it's important to consider what Bloodborne spell you like using and if it suits your playstyle. Now Kalios, for those unfamiliar, has a Bloodborne spell, 1 mana, teleport a minion 2 spaces. Now what this is really good for is allowing you to play your spell synergy minions that are a little bit fragile for their mana cost, such as Four Winds Magi and Chakri Avatar, and it allows you to play them safe, get their effects off, and then teleport them into action to deal extra damage to the general. However, unlike Reavers, there's a lot of situations where you won't even have a target for your Bloodborne spell or ability to use it at all. This is the downside to Kalios, and it allows players who can keep on clearing the board against Spellhai to punish it. However, when you have these big minions on board, these Chakri Avatars that are getting bigger, it allows you to really put that face damage in, and it's definitely a weakness of Reaver decks, is that these big Chakri Avatars and Four Winds Magi are often unable to hit the general because there's not a lot of teleport spells being run. Now, there are two categories of Spellhai, which I've kind of simplified it to. Now, the first one is using Kalios, and is a deck a lot of people have contributed to Wicked Flux. Now, this is his Spellhai deck using Kalios, and we can see it actually runs quite a decent minion package and a few more minion based spells such as Juxtaposition. We also see less out of hand damage with only 1 Saberspine Seal, only 1 Spiral Technique, and 1 less Blood Rage Mask than other decks. Now, this deck focuses a lot more on clearing the board and using spells to help clear the board while also dealing some incremental damage with stuff like Chakri Avatar, Blood Rage Mask, and Four Winds Magi. Now, what this deck lacks for in explosive power, it has more board control and a better early game. Often with other Spellhai decks that don't run stuff like Healing Mystic and Blood Tear Alchemist, it's very, very easy to miss your turn 1, and that is definitely a weakness of the deck. I will compare this to my personal deck, which is a slight variation of Robno's old Spellhai deck, using only 9 minions and a Reaver deck. Now, Reaver does compensate for the lack of minions in the deck with that really powerful Bloodborne spell. It also allows really explosive turns. All your draws are either spell synergy or a spell-based minion. You don't have stuff like Blood Tear and Healing Mystic that don't really further the Spellhai game plan, though they are situationally really powerful cards. There are lots of variations of this deck. You can mess around with the Spiral Techniques, the Heaven's Eclipses. There is room for other minions in the deck. Something like Alcuin Lawmaster is also a good budget option. I personally really like this style of deck because it allows me to be proactive with my Bloodborne spell, and being able to fit Killing Edge in there is also really nice. Now, I have seen people using stuff like Deathstrike Seal instead. I personally prefer Killing Edge, but it is a personal preference, and there's definitely quite a few spells you can mix around, find your own personal preferences. Now, obviously, you can mess around with this. You can run different amounts of minions, but I think this is a pretty core shell of these 9 minions. You can maybe cut a Chakri, but I wouldn't cut anything else there. Definitely 2 very different options, but still a pretty similar game plan, and this guide should hopefully cover enough ground that anyone playing either of these decks should be able to get a good idea of how to play Spellhai, because it is a very complicated deck and there's lots and lots of decision making that you'll be making every single game. Now, one of the questions I see asked more than anything else when I'm talking about Songhai is, when do I go for board control? When do I go for face damage? Do I simply just hit face whenever I can, deal as much damage as I can every turn, or do I try and clear the board every turn? Now, the short answer is that it's not clear. It changes every single game throughout the game. But there are a couple of principles. Now, you can see there are 3 cards on screen. I will get to them later in more detail. Now these are not cards that give you a strict indication of whether you should go board control or face damage, but they're cards that having them in your hand can help influence your play one way or the other, whether you go for board control or face damage. As a general rule, there are a couple times when you can be pretty sure that you want to start going for face damage, as early game is nearly always going for board control. So when do you switch gears? Well, sometimes you have to evaluate that there's no way you're going to be able to keep up on a value game by board clearing. Now this may simply be that you're running low on cards and you can't afford to waste your valuable resources clearing lower cost minions or minions that will take 3 cards to deal with. Obviously if you have to send 3 cards to kill an Ironcliffe Guardian, maybe it's time to start going face. Obviously that's a bit risky as an example, but using a lot of resources clearing 1 minion, it's probably better just to save them to try and go face and burst your opponent down. So if you don't think that you can keep up on the value game, you're going low on cards, maybe you need to consider going face. It's also important to consider that some decks you will not have a late game win against. Stuff like a Seaver becomes very, very powerful in the late game, and you won't be able to keep dealing with those threats. You don't interact well with Shadow Novas. In the late game they will win. So at times you need to decide, I need to start putting the pressure on now, because if this game goes too late, I will lose. So you can try and set up for some couple turn lethals, that kind of thing. Another way to consider it is, can you see lethal in 2 turns? Can you set it up for 2 turns later? Can you set it up for 3 turns later? And can you play around the outs? Will 1 Emerald Rejuvenator stop you? Well, if you think your opponent might be running it, maybe it's too risky. If you think you've got nothing to lose, and there's a very small chance your opponent has an Emerald Rejuvenator, maybe you should go for it. And it's also important to consider, how hard will you get punished if you go face? If you have the initiative, the board's clear and it's your turn, going face is a little bit less risky, just because, otherwise you might be doing nothing. So there's a lot of situations when you should start going face, but a lot of them comes down to desperation, where your board clears won't be efficient or where you can set up lethal. Now coming back to these cards on screen, these are cards that will help you decide if you should keep going board control or face. Now Spiral Technique is a big one and a really good example of this. I personally really like running 2 Spiral Technique, and I try to run it in all Songhai decks, especially Spellhai. What it does is it allows you to have a finisher in 1 card. Now it's not the most efficient spell, 8 damage for 8 mana is not efficient compared to stuff like Phoenix Fire, but it's a lot of damage in 1 card. If you can use all your other cards to get your opponent down to 17 damage dealt to them, then a Spiral Technique will just finish them off. If I have a Spiral Technique in hand, then getting my opponent to 8 when I suspect they don't have healing is a definite win condition. At times, I'll even try to get them down to 8 using nearly all my resources in my hand, get them down to 8 HP, and then a couple turns later I can win the game with a Spiral Technique that I already have in hand. Now obviously you have to evaluate, what are my chances of surviving, what are my chances of my opponent having healing, but it's very important to play around this card, and in games where you start to fall behind, often you need to make desperation plays, put your opponent to that 8 health threshold and hope to draw a Spiral Technique, which is the reason I really like drawing 2 of them. Now Blood Rage Mask is another one. Blood Rage Mask is an interesting card in this way, in that it can definitely go both ways. Blood Rage Mask allows you to keep doing chip damage to your opponent whilst also clearing their board. Now you really want to get a lot of value out of your Blood Rage Mask, hopefully dealing at least 4 damage with it. 3 is pretty reasonable, but definitely 4 can be expected a large amount of the time. So if I have a hand full of stuff like Ghost Lightning and Twin Strike, plus a Blood Rage Mask, then I can keep going for this board control plan, because I'm going to be clearing my opponent's board while doing a bunch of damage to them and keeping my hand decently full. But if I have Blood Rage Mask and a bunch of Phoenix Fires and Saberspine Seals, the only way I'm really going to be getting full value out of this Blood Rage Mask is if I'm using those Saberspine Seals very aggressively, because it's not really a card that you can use to clear a bunch of minions at once. You want to be casting your spells in decent sized bursts to get full value out of stuff like Blood Rage Mask. This applies to stuff like Four Winds Magi as well. But what it does is it allows you to get max value over things. So maybe that includes going face, maybe it includes clearing the board and getting the damage that way. Definitely something to always be considering, and it is also symbolic of the way you will play around Four Winds Magi to an extent. Now, Heaven's Eclipse is another interesting one and can also go both ways. Heaven's Eclipse can allow you to play a more value-based game. It can give you card advantage, and the spells can be definitely useful, give you lots of fuel for late game against control decks. But what it can also do is it allows you to take riskier plays. If you want to burst down your opponent and then hopefully kill them in a few turns, a turn where you can Heaven's Eclipse soon will hopefully give you the fuel to finish the game the turn after you Heaven's Eclipse, or even the turn after that. Often, if I have a pretty bursty hand and a Heaven's Eclipse, I'll try and burst my opponent, and then I can Heaven's Eclipse and then try and find a spiral technique or just refuel my hand and get back to board control. Definitely a card that you need to think about how you want to use it, what you hope to draw, and can it allow me to continue to get board control, or will it allow me to set up lethal for a couple turns? So lots of things to think about. It really does depend. What is my win condition? Can I win if I keep trying to control the board, or is it a losing battle? Am I going to run out of resources? And face damage. Can I reasonably expect to draw the cards that can finish off my opponent? Is it my only chance? And that's often the situation, is that when you get into a losing battle, you should just start going face most of the time, because the deck can pull off some really, really insane damage. Now, before we jump into faction-based mulligans, we're going to talk about general mulligan guides that basically will be used in all games, and you don't really need to think too much about your opponent's class or what deck they might be playing. Now, this applies especially to if you're playing the Reaver deck with 9 or less minions, but it also does apply to Kalios Spellhai with a few more minions. And that is, you very, very rarely will mulligan away a minion. You really, really want to hit those minions as early as possible. And since you don't have 9, if you're not getting them in the mulligan, it gets a little bit harder to draw. There is some cycle, but you really want to get them as soon as possible. And during the game, if you're ever replacing, you really need a good reason to be getting rid of a minion, especially one not named Chakri Avatar later in the game. Now, the reason for this is that having these minions is really, really good, because most of our decks are spells. So we have these spell synergy minions. We know that our next few draws are going to be spells, and we'll be able to support them really, really well. So pretty simple there. Really just looking for minions. Pretty much never going for spell over a minion early on in the game. If you do have 4 or 5 in your opening hand, maybe you can get rid of 1. But even then, I might still consider, because you're going to start drawing spells after that. Now, the next two are a little bit more interesting. This is definitely my opinion. You can definitely try different stuff with this. It's not set in stone by any means, but after my experience of the deck, I definitely believe this is the best choice. Now, Mana Vortex is a spell that I very, very rarely get rid of. It's so, so good in this deck. It's the absolute MVP of the deck, because we're always going to have spells that will benefit from costing 1 less. There's very, very little downside, apart from the fact that, if you're just cycling it, then there's a slight downside because you don't know what card you're going to draw instead of just having that card. But because we get that discount, it's such a good card and allows us to have really nice early turns with stuff like Chakri Avatar, Four Winds Magi. Even just getting our Bloodborne spell out and developing something else is really nice. Definitely a card I like to see in my opening hand and like to see throughout the game. Very rarely is this card I'm ever just cycling without using the discount. Phoenix Fire is another one, and is a little bit more questionable than Mana Vortex, but I still believe it has a place. The only matchup I'd consider not keeping it in is Cassiva or Lilith, because they might not have early minions that will be vulnerable to Phoenix Fire. I still think it's the correct choice. It allows us to apply pressure, going on 4 mana, playing a Four Winds Magi on a mana tile, Mana Vortex, Phoenix Fire. That's 5 damage to the face, 2 damage to the opponent if you want to clear a minion. So versatile. Allows us to push for damage, allows us to get cheap procs off. Really, really nice card to have in our opening hand and throughout most of the game. So that will conclude our general mulligan strategy. Now we'll go into some more faction specific cards. Before we jump into specific faction mulligan decisions, I want to just make it clear that this section of the video is not meant to be set in stone. It's not meant to be something that you can just look at and automatically know each play, because that's frankly not the way that Spellhai works. It's a very decision based, very situational, lots of different cards that can be good in different situations. This is some kind of thing to think about when you're going through mulligans and also applying to early replaces, when you have a bunch of spells in hand, even sometimes artifacts, do I get rid of this one? Do I get rid of that one? Because often it's not clear. This is a guide to what cards are good in some matchups and what ones you want to keep potentially. Often it will be between this card and a Ghost Lightning or this card and a Twin Strike, and it's not always clear which one will be better. So these are my thoughts on each faction and what cards have the potential to be kept in a mulligan. Now for Lyonar, Onyx Best Seal is an amazing card that allows the matchup to actually be very winnable. I would never ever replace an Onyx Best Seal unless I'm late game looking for lethal, or maybe I have 3 of them. Even then I consider it so good. Lyonar is a very honest faction in the sense that it just wants to drop one big minion a turn a lot of the time. Onyx Best Seal allows you to get a tempo gain, get that spell synergy, and protect you from unbeatable threats otherwise, such as Ironcliff Guardian. Very strong card, almost always keeping everyone I can. Saberspine Seal is a little bit more of a situational one, but it's something to keep in mind when you're planning out your early turns. And the reason that Saberspine Seal is good is because it's a really good answer to a turn 1 Silverguard Knight when you're going first. You can go up, kill it with 1 mana and your general. Really nice card, allows you to get nice tempo in the early game, and you basically remove the 3 mana threat, only taking 3 damage for 2 less mana. Pretty good. Blood Rage Mask is another one. You need to be careful against stuff like Celerity, Lion, but apart from that, Lyonar doesn't have a lot of chip damage anymore, and if your opponent's sending early Saberspine Tigers into your face, it's a win for you. Definitely need to be careful, you don't want to get provoked and then waste it, but when you can reasonably expect to deal with your opponent's board and also get some damage off with this Blood Rage Mask, can be very good, and it's definitely a faction that I will often consider equipping a turn 1 Blood Rage Mask if I don't have a turn 1 player otherwise. On to Vetruvian. Now Vetruvian is quite an interesting matchup. I do believe it may slightly be favoured for the Songhai player, but it does heavily depend on the list Vetruvian is running. Lots of different types such as Sabotage, we need to be careful about Zenrui. There's stuff like Amaya healers you always need to be worrying about, and then there's also the aggro variant, which makes Vetruvian a little bit scary. Now I've included Ghost Lightning here. I don't think it's an automatic keep by any means, but what I like it for is just a safeguard, respecting the fact that there's still a decent amount of aggro Vetruvian running around, and this card can be very good against it. Deals with stuff like Dunecasters, Flameblood Warlocks really well, Pyromancer as well occasionally. Definitely fine to keep if your hand is looking pretty good. Sometimes you'll get rid of it, sometimes you'll keep it. It's really a judgment matter. And can I deal with aggro otherwise, or will I just even stomp aggro if I keep this card? Sometimes that is also a consideration. Onyx Best Seal. Now this is not about the aggro Vetruvian matchup whatsoever. This is about Sabotage and Control, often trying just to drop 1 big minion, stuff like Primus Shieldmaster, Dilatus, and of course Amaya Healer, which are all must answer cards. When they drop these though, and you can hit Onyx Best Seals, it allows you to be really aggressive. You can hit face, you can develop your own stuff while getting a tempo advantage. Very good when you have these in multiples, and cannot really worry about your opponent's board, because it does allow you to ignore board a bit just by Onyx Best Seal, forget about it, and then keep doing damage. Now Inner Focus is a card I have included here, and once again, it's not a card that you can just straightforward say, keep this in every mulligan against Vetruvian. That's what the general mulligan strategy guide is kind of for. What Inner Focus allows us to do is kind of nullify the strength that 0 mana Siphon Soul that Vetruvian has access to, how good it is against that deck, nullifies Chakri Avatar almost completely, takes away a very strong effect from Lantern Fox, and we can play around this stuff by using Inner Focus, getting some value, dealing some damage, and getting maybe a Phoenix Fire before our opponent even has a chance to silence it. So definitely a card I'll keep very often if my opponent, or if I already have a Lantern Fox or a Chakri Avatar. Now onto Abyssian. Now Abyssian is a matchup for this deck that I personally think is very good for the Songhai player. I've checked my stats personally, and on my road to S rank, from rank 5 to S, I versed 11 Abyssians and I beat every single one of them. One of the reasons for this is I personally run 3 Ghost Lightning, which is really good in the Lilith matchup. Lets you worry not about any of these massive swarms. You can time it and clear off a few Bloodborne spells, all that kind of thing. Very good card in the matchup for obvious reasons. Now another card that I think is also really important in the Lilith matchup is Onyx Bear Seal. Now, the Swarm is just one half of the threat from Lilith. Those really big minions, Vorpal Reaver, Reaper of the Nine Moons, Black Solar, Spectral Revenant, can all mess up your day if left unattended, and that's why I like to keep Onyx Bear Seals, and definitely like to keep them throughout the game. A very strong card in this deck. You don't care about the Pando too much, and you can easily clean up with a Twin Strike, so having lots of Bear Seals, you'll see that's a little bit of a theme. Very good. Not something you want against Cassiva. Same with Ghost Lightning. Sometimes Ghost Lightning can be good in Cassiva, but a lot of the time, if I have something better, don't really feel the need to keep it. Now onto Blood Rage Mask. Blood Rage Mask is a card that I'll always equip and keep in my mulligan against Cassiva especially. Possibly Lilith, it can be a little bit iffy. It depends if you think you can clear the board. Stuff like Ghost Lightning means, well, your opponent's not going to be able to deal with it too easily. There's not a lot of pings still in Abyssian, not as much Void Pulse running around, Darkseid. Very good card that Abyssian isn't the best at dealing with, especially if you can keep their board clear. Magmar is another deck that I believe is a good matchup for Spellhai, and the reason for this is the weak early game of Magmar, plus their weakness in dealing with ranged threats such as Heartseeker and Four Winds Magi. Now, there's a couple of different cards that you can consider keeping, and it also depends on which general you're versing. Twin Strike is a card that I believe is pretty good against both types of Magmar. Both Magmars will try and deal with the early game with their own proactive minions, stuff like Young Silthar, occasionally Vindicators, Kujata, which Twin Strike is pretty decent for dealing with, and you'll often find a target pretty early on, plus it's very good against the aggro variants and the occasional Starhorn Mechazor deck. Now, Onyx Bear Seal is a card that you'll definitely want to keep against Vath, because often it's a control deck, and occasionally against Starhorn. Then it becomes a bit more hand specific, because they're not likely to run that many big minions. Very good against Vath, can definitely get you some tempo and deal with the bigger threats. Blood Rage Mask is a card I really like against Magmar, even the aggro variants a lot of the time, just because Magmar is really bad at dealing with artifacts. It's been a theme through many different decks you'll play. Artifacts so good against Magmar, and if they're chucking early rush minions at you, that's fine. That's a lot of value for a 1-mana card that forces your opponent to Saber Spine you when they otherwise wouldn't. So very good matchup, I think. You do need to be worried about Earth Sphere, but you're able to control the board pretty well, and actually sometimes you can just outvalue your opponent pretty hard, but also they have a lot of trouble dealing with their threats, and 1 or 2 Four Winds Magi should seal the game pretty early, so look for cards that also can support an early Four Winds Magi. On to the Vanar matchup. Now, Vanar is unique in that there's quite a few different styles of Vanar. We have Fey face decks, Kara Zoo, as some people call them, I'm not a big fan of that name, Zoo kind of board control decks, where they're buffing up a bunch of minions, and then you also have stuff like Fey Walls and Fey late game decks, so lots of different options. I really do like Twin Strike in a lot of these matchups, just because Vanar typically has to play a lot of minions early on. Even Kara, which is the more controlling of the two generals generally, it's still pretty vulnerable to Twin Strike, a really nice card. Now, Ghost Lightning is something I wouldn't really keep against Kara a lot of the time, unless I felt like my hand needed it and I had a few other dead cards. But it's very good against aggro Fey, and there's always a few 1 health minions running around in these Vanar decks, so definitely a very nice card and helps you deal with aggro Vanar very well. Now, Blood Rage Mask is a card that I definitely want to keep against Fey most of the time. There's so many sources of damage, especially with that Bloodborne spell that can help deal with that artifact. But against Kara that doesn't have that Bloodborne spell, won't be running a lot of aggressive minions, can get tons of value, allow you to keep dealing damage right from the start of the game. And as Songhai against Vanar, a lot of times you want to be really pressuring that life total down hard, especially against Kara, so you can hit them in the face, equip a Blood Rage Mask, deal a few damage procs, and if they want to try and clear off their Blood Rage Mask, it might take a couple turns, and they'll have to hit you with a general a few times, which is something that's really good for you. So very good in the Kara matchup, not so good against Fey. If I'm keeping it against Fey, then I'm going to be saving it to burst down. I'm not going to be just equipping it turn 1, and there's a few matchups that are like that. Onto the Songhai Mirror Match. Now, Songhai Mirror Match is very interesting with this deck, and depending on your variant of Spellhai, can be very good or just decent. I don't think a Spellhai deck is ever going to be too terrible against any other Songhai deck. Now, there is some Ancestral Divination decks running around, which is definitely a consideration. They're getting more and more popular, which is why Ghost Lightning can be good or really good. Against a Reaver, I'm definitely keeping Ghost Lightning just because if it's Ancestral Divination deck, it becomes amazing. Plus, it's already pretty good against the Bloodborne spell. Against Kalios, it gets a little tricky. If the rest of my hand is pretty bad, I'll keep a Ghost Lightning, but I'm probably looking for better cards that deal with single threats a bit more efficiently. Inner Focus. Now, Inner Focus is really strong in the matchup just because tempo becomes really important. This card is a really strong tempo card. Allows you to get out Shakri Avatar damage really early, snowball the game, and Lantern Fox, obviously always very good with Inner Focus. I really like Inner Focus in this matchup just because it allows you to get so much early damage, and early damage can really snowball in mirror matchups, especially Songhai. You can keep pressuring your opponent down, force them to make awkward trades, and having that higher health total can be really nice in dictating the flow of the game. Onto Saber-Spine Seal, for a very similar kind of thing. It also has the convenience of Heartseeker plus Saber-Spine Seal, gives you a really nice answer to Four Winds Magi, which you otherwise might not have, but also allows you just to push damage. If you have a Blood Rage Mask equipped, and then you hit your opponent's face with 2 Saber-Spine Seals, that's so much damage, and then suddenly they're too scared to, clear off your minions with their face, clear off that Blood Rage Mask. Very good card at racing, which often Songhai games will go into because decks are interacting with each other just a little bit less than normal. Where there's a lot of outer damage burst, you just want as much burst as you can get. So definitely a card, a lot higher consideration keeping than otherwise would, because a lot of times Saber-Spine Seal is not that good of an early game card, unless you've got a specific target in mind. Anyway guys, that does include my guide to Songhai, Spellhai in particular of course. If there's anything I left out, please ask me a question. Maybe if there's enough things you guys still want to know, maybe I can talk more about in-depth matchups. Please do let me know what you want to see. Maybe I'll make some more of these. If you guys like it, any feedback is definitely welcome. Really happy that Spellhai is still in a pretty good spot. Songhai is my most played faction. I have over 10 ribbons with the faction and really enjoy it. It's such a fun deck with a really high skill cap. So if you can try this deck, I definitely recommend trying it out. It is honestly a ton of fun. If you want to see more of these type of guides or gameplay videos with Spellhai and other decks, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.